World-famous anime vlogger Gigguk put out a video just earlier today explaining the golden age of anime, the idea that there really is no one golden age, or that you set your own golden age depending on what shows you like, what era was special to you in anime history. And he makes a great point. Everyone's gonna have their own tastes, their own favorites, their own period where they thought anime was all great. But I'm interested in diving a little deeper into what the public consensus golden age of anime is, because there surprisingly is one. If you start looking into the scores that people give to different shows on websites like My Anime List and Anime News Network, and just dive deep into the favorites lists of people around the internet, as I once did back in 2011, and admittedly I haven't updated my research since then, but I'm pretty confident in the things I'm going to say, you'll find that there's certain eras that just have an overwhelming amount more love shown their way than other eras. And there's some pretty good reasons for why. Because while Gigguk is right that anime hasn't really gotten better or worse over time, it has gotten way more densely packed. There is just way more anime coming out now than there was in the past. If you start looking into the early days of animation, I mean the 60s and 70s in particular, there just was not a lot on TV. Most of what was getting made was really long kids shows. There was these giant robot shows like Mazinger and stuff like that that were really popular back then, but it was almost exclusively shows that were made for either a young audience or a very broad audience, usually a young audience, often aimed at little boys. There were some shoujo series, just everything was very basic and sort of laid the foundation for what anime was going to become later. So you don't see a lot of people who have a ton of favorite anime from the 70s, unless that's the only era they like. And once again, Gigguk's right. If that's your era, then that's the golden age. But there's not a whole lot of people who feel that way. So ultimately, while that is the golden age for some people, consensus-wise, not really seeing it. So then we get to the 80s and the early 90s. This period, anime is still mostly either those long TV shows or OVAs. A lot of what's getting made, a lot of the more adult stuff, the stuff that's more genre-specific, and which really informed what anime would eventually become, this otaku-centric sort of pandering, if you want to sound mean about it, shows that are very genre-based and very much aimed at anime fans. Those were mostly OVAs in the 80s and 90s. Short shows that didn't have time to flesh out their characters, didn't have time to have big, interesting worlds and stuff like that. And so a lot of those shows just aren't all that well remembered. Now, just this month, I went through and watched everything that was made in 1991, and I was shocked to find that very, very little anime that anyone still cares about was made that year. I mean, Dragon Ball Z ran through that. It ran from the late 80s up to like 1995, but it wasn't like just in 1991. There were not a lot of shows that ran just that year that were popular. Ranma 1/2 was around this time. That was pretty big, even in the West. But in terms of like widespread appeal, the movies that came out then, like the best stuff that came out then, is not still popular. There was a Ghibli movie that year called Only Yesterday. No one talks about it. There was a movie from the director of Akira called Rojin Z. No one talks about it. People talk about Akira. People talk about Nazca. Those came out in 1988. Now, if you want to talk about the first public consensus golden year for anime, 1988, great choice. A year when a lot of big famous movies came out, and Grave of the Fireflies was that year. I think My Neighbor Totoro, I think I fucked up when I said Nazca, that was a little earlier, but My Neighbor Totoro was that year. A lot of big stuff started in 1988, and a lot of big franchises that continued through the early 90s started that year. So then we get into the 90s, and we have a period where anime on TV starts to become more of a thing. We've got more of the 13-episode, 26-episode shows, these like smaller, complete stories, sometimes complete, sometimes 13 episodes of manga packaged and never finished like it is today most of the time. But we started getting more stuff like your Neon Genesis Evangelion in 1995, or your Revolutionary Girl Utena in 1997, these like big, interesting, intricate series that actually have conclusions, that are actually not aimed at a young audience, but are on TV and do have more fleshed out narratives. So we get to the late 90s, this is where most of the popular shows start coming from. Cowboy Bebop in 1998, Trigun in 1998, Serial Experiments Lain in 1998, a lot of big stuff coming out right here at the tail end of the 90s. Well, then we hit the early 2000s and things get a little bit awkward. So now everyone's drawing on computers. On the one hand, way more anime starts getting made. The early 2000s is where we start seeing shows coming out in big chunks, where a new season of shows comes out and it's a ton of new shows all at once. But the shows look awkward and aren't really that well made because people haven't really gotten used to the new technology yet. And there's a lot of great shows from the early 2000s that, because they just kind of look weird and because their sensibilities are different from what they are now, they don't get talked about as much. Not many people talk about like your Brigadoons and stuff like that are like cult classics that only very few people know about. It's not until the mid-2000s, particularly 2006 and 2007, when everything kind of explodes, especially in the West. Because A, everyone was getting much better at digital animation. Haruhi in 2006 sets the bar pretty much, makes it like, whoa, all these shows about cute girls doing cute things, this is how they should look now. And this is why Moe, which was already a big deal throughout the 2000s, these shows were everywhere, people just weren't paying as much attention to them. It's because Haruhi took that and put it into this package that looked nice and felt good that these shows started getting more attention, they started being animated this way, and they started having more of an impact. So therefore people started talking about them. But this is also when speed subbing culture takes off. 2006, 2007, now suddenly more and more stuff's getting fan subbed, and it's getting fan subbed much faster than it ever has been before. And this is why people like Giguk, who said that he got into anime in 2006 and 7, got into it then, because this is when anime took off. Speed subbing just wasn't really around, and then it was, and then way more people got into it. Streaming became easier, YouTube had just started becoming a thing, tons of streaming sites started popping up. So now if you like anime, you can easily find a bunch of it to watch online, or you can easily find a bunch of it to download. I learned how to torrent in 2007 after watching shitty streams for most of the year. Opened my horizons dramatically. So, 2007 is really the prime year, because while 2006 had Haruhi and Code Geass started and some other popular shows, 2007 is when everything was right in its place. Fan subbing culture was getting big, and a bunch of big shows came out. Haruhi was still a big deal, and then Lucky Star came out and made it a bigger deal, because it made it an ongoing cultural conversation that another show was referencing this previous show, and it made it seem like this was becoming a thing. Tengen Toppa and Lagann ran at the same time, extremely massively popular. Baccano came out. No one paid attention to it when it came out, but a few years later it became very popular. 2007 was a year when a lot of original IPs came out, grew really big, and everyone cared about them. Now, the funny thing is that even though continually more anime has been coming out, even more than 2007, this was also a high point in like density, but it's retained that. There's still a ton of shows coming out each year, but fewer and fewer of them have been original over the years. There's been more and more sequels and more trying to bank on sheer things, because 2008 is also when the economy collapsed and it's never really recovered. Now mind you, Japan was still reeling from an economic collapse in the early 90s, which was part of why OVAs and stuff ended up unfinished, and none of these shows had like conclusions, is because they ran out of money and no one had money and the anime industry was going through a hard time. And while it picked up a little bit in the 2000s, around 2008 the economy collapses again all around the world. This is also when the Western anime industry pretty much collapsed. It had been growing since about 2003 because of stuff like Adult Swim, and DVD sales were good and everyone was paying attention to anime in the West. But then with the rise of fan subs and the rise of quick, easy downloads, and the fact that it was easier to do stuff that way and fewer people were buying DVDs and the economy was collapsing, all these Western anime distributors start shutting down. So 2008, suddenly the West is no longer viable, and that's why we start getting less Western-centric shows, where in the mid-2000s we had a lot of stuff that was being made because the creators thought it might succeed in the West, and that kind of shut down. If you want to see that story fleshed out a little more, watch my Manglobe Studio video where I talk about how all their shows were basically only successful in the West, and then once the West stopped buying anime, they were pretty much done for in terms of making cool original shows. So 2008 onwards, now the economy is in crisis. Anime, which is more expensive to make than it was before because technology is getting better, isn't selling as much as it was before, and it's getting harder and harder to turn a profit. So more and more studios are trying to make sequels, trying to make sure things. They're cutting down the runs of their original content or of their adaptations. Studio Bones used to be everything they did was 26 to 50 episodes, no matter what. Now, almost always 12. Noragami, that show would have seemed like a sure thing 8 years ago, but now it's a 10-episode show that maybe they'll make another season of. Kekkai Sensen Now, gonna run for 12 probably, and could have been 26 5 years ago. So we see how these shows that would have been bigger deals back then just don't have the money to be as big as they are now. And with all these sequels coming out, fewer and fewer people watch each sequel of a show. Let's say that the first season is somewhat popular. Inevitably, the second season has fewer viewers, and the next season has fewer viewers. So even though just as much anime is coming out now, so much of it is sequels, especially, I mean, look at the charts for this year. I think there's 5 or 6 sequels on TV right now, and I'm not watching most of them because I haven't seen the first seasons. So there's this decline in the amount of original shows, the amount of shows that are grabbing new people and grabbing their attention, and because of that, the overall consensus goes down every year. 2007 is still the high point in consensus of what was good, like what year was great for anime. There are still the most popular shows from that year because of the fact that every year there's more and more sequels, and while the sequels are usually better liked than the originals, they usually get higher scores, they have much smaller audiences. So again, it is depending on who you ask. If you're asking people who watch a lot of sequels, they might think that this is the best time ever because the shows that they like are getting continuations. But if you're looking for people who just want to watch 13 to 26 episode shows, which is most people, or, I mean, there's always the long runners, but they go through pretty much every year, so you know, whatever. 2007 would be the optimal year for those kind of people. It's when the most people got into anime, so a lot of people had their favorites defined by that year. It's the year that had the most original programming, the fewest sequels comparatively, that had the highest scores. So, right now, 2007 is the golden age of anime. Do I think it will be superseded one day? I do, because I do think anime is getting better. The problem is that not enough of it is getting better, because we have great shows coming out. Like last year, I thought stuff like Kill La Kill, Space Dandy, and even stuff like Zankyo no Terror, which I didn't enjoy, I felt like it was advancing the medium, where shows were getting better looking, having more interesting animation techniques, having more that they could do with themselves. And seeing the medium get pushed forward makes me think, okay, well now all we have to do is have a year where 10 shows like that come out, and all of them are interesting, and that'll be the new best year of anime. So while techniques are getting better, the money's not there necessarily, the economy's not in the best shape, Japan is just not in a good shape right now. Ever since the earthquake in 2011, they have not really been able to fully recover in any facet of their culture. So I think a time will come when we have a new golden age, but for now, 2007, pretty legit. Of course, once again, like Giguk said, you can choose whichever one is your favorite, but I think the consensus year would be 2007. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, consider supporting me on Patreon, especially if you want to see more videos like this. Subscribe and do all the things, the YouTube things. You watch YouTube, you know the YouTube things.